supposed to lead with religion, and one is sort of reducible to it and should always only be concerned with sort of the notion of, the what's good for the Jews kind of thing. I've been struck in a lot of circumstances by the conservatism and the defensiveness and the sort of, the skepticism on the part of an older Jewish generation when the topic turns to things like black-Jewish relations, how quickly people seem to retreat and be skeptical. And, granted, it's probably extremely stupid of me to, go to a JCC and talk to a bunch of people in their 70s and 80s about Jewish disinvestment from the civil rights movement and how it's time to get over, being mad at Farrakhan. That's not going to go over well. But it's been interesting to me to see how much reluctance there is to even have that conversation. I remember doing talks around the time that the Jeremiah Wright controversy was going on, and I would sort of, without even meaning to, the questions would go in a certain direction, and I would start talking about, this kind of stuff that I was talking about a minute ago, Farrakhan and Sharpton and Jackson and the vilification of them. And, somebody would raise their hand and say, well, what about Jeremiah Wright? And I'd say, what about Jeremiah Wright? Well, he said some things, some anti-Semitic things. I'm like, what did he say? And nobody would be able to answer. And I would start to realize that in the imagination of this audience, any black leader who said anything controversial and was in hot water must automatically be anti-Semitic because there's just that automatic connection. So if Jeremiah Wright was controversial, he must therefore be anti-Semitic, even if nobody could bring to mind anything anti-Semitic that he said. Things like that have been very frustrating. And of course, it can be frustrating when, you give a talk and you read from your book and you put a lot of stuff out there that you think is interesting, and, people seem only interested in finding out why you talk the way you talk.
Right. How much of a driving force in your life is the desire to affect social change?
It's a big desire. I think that one of the struggles of writers is to justify what we do in a way. Writing books takes an enormous amount of time, and it's time that's spent in a room alone, and in a way it's one of the most self-indulgent things you can do. So I think you have to, if you care about social change and you want to be a writer, you have to think that, your books can play a role. They can get people talking, that they can push a conversation forward. So, it's something I struggle with. Should I be in this room writing this book, or should I be, knocking on doors and handing out flyers and organizing, marches or something? And ultimately, the writing always wins out. But it's definitely something I care deeply about, and I think a lot of the works that I look to as sort of touchstones for me are works that I think have done that. So it's definitely something I'm really passionate about trying to be a part of.
A few years ago, I read a fascinating essay by an academic historian, Edward S. Shapiro, on blacks and Jews. Now, Edward Shapiro is modern Orthodox. I wanted to just read you a couple of sentences from what he wrote and get your reaction. If support for blacks is an ineluctable result of Jewish values, then one would expect that the most Jewish of American Jews, the Orthodox of Brooklyn, for example, would be the most sympathetic towards blacks. The exact opposite, however, is true. Secure in their Jewish identity, they do not require close relations with blacks to define it. Their Jewishness rests on more substantial grounds. If the most Jewish of Jews are the least receptive to blacks, the Jews most supportive of blacks have often been alienated from Jewish culture and religion. What do you think?
I think it's an interesting point. I think there's a couple of logical fallacies, at least implied in it, if not sort of overt in it. The first one is the notion that, well, first is the cause and effect, right? If the least Jewish of Jews are the most likely to be receptive to blacks in some way. I mean, in whatever way we define that. The question there is what is the cause and what is the effect? In other words, is it the progressive inclination, the political inclination, and this perhaps, civil rights alliance-esque inclination that in fact has made those people alienated because they're not receiving, support from the Jewish community or from the sort of Orthodox Jewish community for it, right? So what is the cause and what is the effect would be one. The second that I think is interesting and that I think needs to sort of be deconstructed a little bit, I might have to ask you to repeat it, was something in the middle of what you just read about seemed to imply that the idea that identity, that Jewish identity for...
Let me just reread it. Shall I reread it? Okay, I'm going to reread the whole thing. It's only 3 sentences. If support for blacks is an ineluctable result of Jewish values, then one would expect that the most Jewish of American Jews, the Orthodox of Brooklyn, would be the most sympathetic toward blacks. The exact opposite, however, is true. Secure in their Jewish identity, they do not require close relations with blacks to define it. Their Jewishness rests on more substantial grounds. If the most Jewish of Jews are the least receptive to blacks, the Jews most supportive of blacks have often been alienated from Jewish culture and religion.
Right, okay, so the implication in the middle there, the notion that what the alliance or what receptivity, whatever we mean by that, to blacks is about is confirming or reaffirming some kind of Jewish identity. That assumption seems to me to be kind of spurious. I don't know, I mean, obviously this is only 3 sentences, but the idea that there's so many assumptions in these 3 sentences that it's actually kind of astounding to me. Assumption 1 seems to be that, reaching out or caring about, the rights of black people is supposed to function as a reaffirmation of some kind of Jewish identity. So, to extend that, you would have to say that what that effort would be about would ultimately be sort of selfish, would be about, finding out who you are or reaffirming your own identity rather than about actually doing something worth doing in the world. And then there's sort of the assumption of what is more Jewish, what is, clearly this writer feels, is defining Judaism strictly as a matter of adherence to religion and, to traditional ritual and all of that, which is a perfectly valid definition, but certainly probably would not be a definition that would be accepted by the people he's talking about. So, in a lot of ways, he's bringing a set of, assumptions to the writing that I think the people that he is attempting to analyze would probably object strongly to, and I think that's always a problematic way to proceed.
Do you think the Orthodox are more Jewish than you?
They're certainly more religious than me. I couldn't be less interested in deciding who's more religious or in claiming any level of Jewishness, in sort of asserting my right to be as Jewish as somebody else. It's just not something that I think about really. I would say that everybody in my family is Jewish, and that my blood is as Jewish as theirs. Certainly, I'm not religious. In the ways that they would define it, they would probably view me as not Jewish, for that matter. And I think, certainly I can't walk through an Orthodox neighborhood without thinking about whether I'm being viewed as Jewish or not, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? That rather than thinking about the people that I'm looking at and all of that, I'm busy thinking about what they would think of me. I think that's the case for most secular Jews is, our judgment of the Orthodox, our opinions of them end up getting deflected by our presumptions of their opinions of us, which is kind of a weird thing.
That's exactly, I think you put your finger on something there.
Yeah.
Because I'm a convert to Judaism. I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist, so I grew up a Gentile. And in all my life as a Christian, I never recall much competition among Christians who's more Christian than someone else. It's like,
Right.
It doesn't